Alright, so I got a pretty interesting story here for you guys because apparently, according here to the New York Times, the United States government is currently trying to work out some sort of an oil deal with the government of Venezuela, potentially in exchange for some sanctions relief that have been crippling their economy for years now. So, here from the New York Times, they say US allows Chevron to expand energy operations in Venezuela. So, what are they talking about here? They say the U.S. Treasury on Saturday granted Chevron a license for a limited expansion of energy operations in Venezuela, signaling the possible beginning of the country's re-entry into the international oil market. They say foreign investment in the oil sector is something that Venezuela's authoritarian president, Nicolas Maduro, desperately needs to improve the economy. No shit. Now, again, a little bit of backstory here, right? The United States, especially under the Trump administration, has been leveling extremely intense sanctions against the economy of Venezuela, and according to this report that was released just a couple years ago, this has had absolutely devastating consequences for their broader economy. Now, obviously, I'm not somebody who thinks that Nicolas Maduro is some sort of like a perfect guy or a perfect embodiment of socialist Marxist principles or something like that, but at the same time, you also have to recognize his failures. You also have to recognize these very intense sanctions that the United States and the rest of the international community has been imposing on their economy. So yes, obviously getting some of their oil, and keep in mind Venezuela is up there, I think they're top 5 among the global community in terms of their share of oil reserves. So yes, of course, exporting oil and being able to bring in some sort of revenue from that is going to be vitally important for their economy, right? But a couple of other things here, right? So in terms of whether or not he is an authoritarian president, right? Okay, so again, not the perfect embodiment of what I would consider socialist principles, okay? Obviously, right? This is a guy who definitely does have some authoritarian tendencies to him, but the way that they frame this here in the New York Times and the way that they frame this from the United States State Department, from the government of the United States for years now, is basically just complete bullshit. Because what this comes down to, the reason why we have been sanctioning them, the reason why we are so aggressive in calling out some of his authoritarian tendencies, has absolutely nothing to do with the proposing of an expansion of democracy or a freedom within Venezuela. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. It is entirely about economics. In this case, it is specifically centered around the ability for U.S. corporations to exploit the resources of Venezuela, right? So they kind of try to tie these two phenomenons here together, as in like not wanting foreign investment, or in other words, U.S. corporations to come in to use your resources without, as they're going to get to further down into this article, without actually even paying taxes or giving any revenue streams to the government of Venezuela, and therefore, by tangent to that, to the people of Venezuela, and trying to equate that with authoritarianism. No. There are many other governments around the world who want to use the resources within their own country for their own country's benefit, right? That's not an inherently bad thing. And so there's a fundamental point that needs to be made here. Number one, the United States, just over the last couple of months, what we've seen from the Biden administration, getting on his hands and knees and groveling to one of the most brutal dictators in the entire world, Mohammed bin Salman, so that they can give us more favorable oil deals or release more into the global oil markets. This is clearly not a country, this is clearly not a government in the United States that is resoundingly taking a firm stance against authoritarianism, okay? It's a complete farce. Now, again, the fundamental point to be made here is really that capitalism and, fascism are intertwined like this. And so, especially if you look at the history of the U.S. track record within Central and South America, especially over the 20th century, we have backed far-right fascist dictatorships, we have backed far-right death squads, essentially explicitly for the purpose of, at the end of the day, allowing our corporations to go in and exploit the resources or the labor of these different countries. So our interest in sanctioning the Venezuelan economy, or our interest in trying to dislodge Nicolas Maduro, has nothing to do with freedom or democracy or anything like that. It has everything to do with this type of a deal being allowed to take place, right? Having a US-based corporation, Chevron, which, just by the way, as a reminder, has been price gouging the American people for months now on gas prices, while they make tens and tens of billions of dollars in excess profits and use that money on things like stock buybacks and dividends. It is 100% about allowing these U.S. corporations to go in and exploit their resources. Okay, so that being said, let's just go ahead and continue here, right? So they say the license was issued in response to the resumption of talks between representatives of Mr. Maduro's government and the Venezuelan opposition in Mexico on Saturday, after a stalemate that stretched for more than a year. They say the two sides agreed that billions in government funds that were frozen abroad should be transferred to a humanitarian fund administered by the United Nations. So again, another point that needs to be made here when they're talking about Venezuelan opposition, keep in mind, under the Trump administration, the United States literally tried to do a coup attempt and install this guy, Juan Guaido, as the president of the United States. And in fact, many top key U.S. government officials still recognize Juan Guaido as the official president of Venezuela, as they are turning around and going and working out these oil deals with Nicolas Maduro. Okay, it's kind of a bizarre and ridiculous at face value situation. But again, obviously part of the reason why there has been this, a standoff or a stalemate between the opposition within Venezuela and the Maduro government within Venezuela is because the United States has not been a good faith actor in this equation for the entirety of it. Okay, so they continue on here saying that a senior Biden administration official described Saturday's announcements as, quote, important steps in the right direction, but added that there was a long way to go in resolving Venezuela's complex economic, political, and humanitarian crisis. Honestly, in my opinion at least, we should not be sanctioning the government of Venezuela, right? I mean, again, the United States around the world objectively allies with, in many cases, gives military support or, intelligence support to a vast majority of the world's dictatorships, okay? We are not averse to working with authoritarian governments, right? So that line, that narrative is complete dog shit, all right? And so they continue here, saying that the deal is part of a shift in U.S. strategy on Venezuela that many analysts say has been accelerated by reduced global oil supplies as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They say Venezuela holds vast oil reserves and its energy production potential has grown in global relevance amid the largest land war in Europe since World War II. They say in a call with reporters on Saturday, the senior U.S. official rejected the notion that the license had been issued to Chevron as a result of an increase in energy prices. Really? I mean, really, do they expect people to buy that? They say saying it was part of an effort by the Biden administration to restore democracy to Venezuela. Okay, so again, I mean, you don't hear the same type of a narrative coming out when we're talking about the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Israel, for example, right? Whenever it comes to either apartheid governments or dictatorships or authoritarian governments or whatever the case may be, the underlying principle at play here has nothing to do with spreading democracy or freedom. Okay, it has everything to do with economic control over resources and labor. So if you have countries that are more amenable to U.S. multinational corporate interests, okay, or U.S. geopolitical interests, then the United States is perfectly willing to overlook their brutality or their authoritarianism. Okay, so obviously this is not something where the Biden administration is trying to take some principled stance in restoring democracy to Venezuela. I mean, we've heard that line played before, right? Look how, restoring democracy to Iraq turned out for the United States and the people of Iraq, right? I mean, this is not something where we have, number one, a good track record, especially when it comes to, again, in Latin America, we've had, dozens and dozens of coup attempts and backing a lot of far-right dictatorships in the country purely because they happen to coincide with our economic interests and wanting to dominate these global markets, right? So, I mean, again, it's just kind of like laughable at face value that they would, number one, try to claim that this isn't being done because of the higher gas prices that we have seen over the last couple of months after the invasion of Ukraine, and trying to suggest that this has something to do with restoring democracy. Okay, it's completely fucking ridiculous. But a little bit more info in terms of what this deal actually is. They say the Chevron deal is limited in scope. It is good for 6 months and must be renewed after that. Now, part of the problem with this aspect of it, is that Venezuela's oil is a lot thicker and harder to actually refine. So, if this is a 6 month deal that needs to be renewed after that, and have further negotiations depending on how the first 6 months periods goes, then this is something where you could run into issues because it's going to take a while. In fact, it could take a couple years, as they point out in this article, for this entire process to actually get back up and running close to a higher capacity. But They continue saying that the agreement leaves space for the United States to revoke it if Mr. Maduro does not follow through on the humanitarian or other commitments, or to offer him future concessions if he does. They say the Biden administration is also calling on Maduro to allow the United Nations to have unfettered access to Venezuela to write and publish assessments on the progress of the new humanitarian agreement. So, apparently this is something that Maduro is willing to do. Obviously I think that this is a pretty lopsided deal, as you're going to see here with a little bit more information on it in terms of what the potential, benefits would be to the actual government of Venezuela under Maduro versus the benefits to the United States and to Chevron. But, if this is something that he wants to do as, sort of a starting launch off point towards potentially getting some of these brutal sanctions off of the backs of Venezuelan people, or, beginning the process of trying to somewhat normalize relationships with the United States or other, Western countries around the world, that could potentially be a positive thing in the long run, right? But they say the Chevron deal would allow the company to expand operations at a few projects that it already runs with the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA, and to import Venezuelan oil to the United States. So apparently this is just a one-way deal between the United States and Venezuela, obviously not going to be continuing or, starting the exporting of this to other countries around the world, which is also kind of a bizarre, parameter to put around this, right? I mean, who the fuck are we to say who we can and cannot sell, who Venezuelans can and cannot sell oil to on the global markets? I mean, it's completely ridiculous at face value, but they say it specifically states that the oil company is prohibited from paying any taxes or royalties to the government of Venezuela. Instead, according to the Biden administration official, profits earned will go toward the repayment of government debt to Chevron. Okay, so again, I mean, it seems like this is a pretty lopsided deal here in favor of Chevron and not for the actual government of Venezuela. How are you going to say that we're opening up, the production of oil within Venezuela, but you're not allowed to give any revenue whatsoever in the form of taxes or anything like that to the government of Venezuela, and that it's 100% going towards some sort of like debt repayments to Chevron in and of themselves? I mean, it's just like kind of a bizarre way to structure this deal. It's very stringent and limited in its scope. But they continue down here saying that Francisco Monaldi, the director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University, said that the Chevron deal was not just symbolic. Within 2 years, the company could be producing more than 200,000 barrels a day in Venezuela, adding to the approximately 765,000 barrels now pumped daily, according to Argus and Industry Monitor. So again, they say in 2 years, they could be upping this to 200,000 excess barrels per day. The deal is 6 months long, right? So they're going to have some future negotiations depending on how this all goes. They say the issue to watch going forward, he added, is whether other companies will be able to use the Chevron deal to pressure Washington into lifting further sanctions against Venezuela. They say current U.S. rules prohibit both American and foreign companies from buying Venezuelan oil, but entities like Repsol in Spain and Reliance in India have lobbied Washington for sanctions relief for years, Mr. Minaldi said. And they say while the multi-billion-dollar humanitarian aid deal still needs to be finalized, on Saturday, the Venezuelan government and opposition signed an accord laying out the framework for monitoring that future program. So again, I mean, just at a baseline level here, how ridiculous is it that the United States right now is going to Mohammed bin Salman, probably the single most brutal dictator on the face of the planet, and begging him to release more oil into the global markets, right? Perfectly fine and acceptable for us to work with this, theocratic dictator who, massacres innocent people within his own country, is a, huge exporter of terrorism around the region, somebody who has very brutal authoritarian policies for his own people. It's perfectly fine for us to go work with this guy, a guy who's doing a genocide in Yemen right now, but it's somehow also okay for us to sanction Venezuela into oblivion, and not only sanction them like from the perspective of what we are buying from them, but also preventing other countries like India from buying their oil. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense from a baseline principled stance. If you actually had a principled stance against all forms of authoritarianism or something like that, then you wouldn't be doing all of these deals with governments like Saudi Arabia, right? But then you turn around and say that not only the United States isn't going to buy Venezuelan oil, but other countries around the world, if you want to do business with the largest, economy on the face of the planet with the United States, then you also are not allowed to go buy their oil. I mean, it's completely fucking ridiculous, right? But I mean, again, at the end of the day, obviously this is a deal that is intended for the explicit purpose of what the United States aim within Venezuela and most other countries around the world actually is, which is, if you are an authoritarian government, if you are, somebody who has some of these more brutal or, dictatorial tendencies or something like that, it's completely irrelevant to the equation that is at play here, right? That's why they're structuring this deal in the way that they are, to be so favorable to Chevron and unfavorable to the government of Venezuela. The actual solution here at the end of the day would be for the United States to just stop fucking sanctioning Venezuela, right? Because if you have some sort of a principled opposition to some of his policies or some of his, the way that his government is structured, then you would also be applying sanctions to Israel. You would also be applying sanctions to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE and to all of these other countries around the world that are brutal and authoritarian, and we don't even touch. I mean, we supply them with weapons, right? Not only are we not sanctioning Saudi Arabia or Israel, we are giving them weapons support. We are giving them intelligence support. We are actively, diplomatically propping them up and aiding and abetting in their brutality, right? So it's just a complete double standard here, and it's very clear what the actual underlying motivations are, right? The United States has never been a proponent of freedom and democracy around the world. We are a proponent of whatever at the end of the day potentially is going to have a positive impact for the profit margins of our multinational corporations. That's it. I mean, it's really that simple. And you can see it again with the way that they structured this deal to heavily favor Chevron, right? So, I mean, again, at the end of the day, potentially this could have good implications for the future relationship between the United States and Venezuela. Obviously, if you're the Venezuelan government, you're looking at the current situation and you probably have limited options that are actually on the table. You obviously can't continue with the economic devastation that Venezuela has been experiencing over the last couple of years. And so, you don't have much leverage when it comes to dictating the terms or the outlines of some sort of an oil deal like this. But hopefully, this actually goes well. Hopefully, this is just the beginning of the process towards getting these sanctions off of Venezuela and potentially, allowing them to actually participate in the international community.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying